Hi, everyone. Welcome to the seventh Bar Talks session. This is LGBT politics, LGBTQ politics, and the press. And I'm the Jim Provenzano, the producer of these monthly events. I'm going to hand it over to Matthew Bajko, who is the Bay Area Reporter's assistant news editor, and he'll be moderating the panel. Take it away, Matthew.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Well, for readers of B.A.R, all five of our panelists should be well known to everyone, but just in case, I am going to introduce everyone. So joining us tonight, we have Honey Mahogany, who is a performer, MC, social worker, and activist who grew up in San Francisco and received her master's in social welfare from UC Berkeley. Chair of the San Francisco Democratic Party and a legislative aide to San Francisco District 6 Supervisor Matt Haney, Honey co-founded the Transgender Cultural District and co-owns the legendary Stud Bar. Featured in publications Adult Magazine, The Advocate, Forbes, and Vogue, and TV series like HBO's Looking, and perhaps most famously RuPaul's Drag Race. Among Honey's many honors is being sainted by the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence. Robert Bernardo is the communications director for the Port of Oakland, the fifth busiest seaport in the country. The port owns and operates Oakland International Airport, plus 20 miles of commercial waterfront, including Jack London Square. Robert oversees the port's press office, advertising and marketing programs, crisis communications, and its website. He served as a criminal investigator at the San Francisco DA's office in the 1990s. A former two-term harbor commissioner in San Mateo County, Robert graduated from the University of California, Davis with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English. And as anyone who follows him on social media knows, he likes to travel to comic book conventions around the world and also collects antique art and toys. Ken Yeager has had a long career in both policymaking and as a leader in the LGBTQ community. After coming out publicly in 1984, Ken co-founded the Bay Area Municipal Elections Committee. 37 years later, BAMEC remains the most influential LGBTQ political organization in the South Bay. His election in 1992 to the San Jose Evergreen Community College District saw Ken become the first openly gay elected official at any level in Santa Clara County. He went on to be the first out person elected to the San Jose City Council in 2000 and the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors in 2006. With a PhD from Stanford University, Ken had taught at San Jose State University in the political science department prior to starting his political career. And since being turned out of office at the end of 2028, Ken has been executive director of the nonprofit arm of BAMEC, the BAMEC Community Foundation, and this past June helped open the Queer Silicon Valley Museum exhibit at History San Jose. And David Campos was brought to the U.S. as an undocumented child, escaping political and economic turmoil in his native Guatemala. He graduated from Stanford University and then Harvard Law School to go on to be a San Francisco police commissioner and the former general counsel for the San Francisco Public Schools. David served on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors for 2 full terms, representing District 9, which includes the neighborhoods of the Mission, Bernal Heights, and the Portola. He then became deputy county executive for the County of Santa Clara, overseeing various offices such as LGBTQ affairs and the Division of Equity and Social Justice. He is currently on leave as chief of staff for San Francisco District Attorney Chesa Boudin as he runs for state assembly. And Gwenn Craig moved to San Francisco in 1975 and quickly became enmeshed in the lesbian and gay activism sparked by Anita Bryant's national crusade opposing anti-discrimination legislation. In 1976, she met Harvey Milk and later became an active volunteer in his successful supervisorial campaign. In 1978, when the statewide Brings initiative, known as Proposition 6, was placed on the ballot to ban lesbian and gay teachers from California public schools, Harvey Milk chose Gwenn and her close friend and ally, Bill Krause, to co-manage the citywide campaign organization known as San Franciscans Against Proposition 6. After they helped to defeat Prop 6 that November, Gwenn served as a 2-term president of the Harvey Milk LGBTQ Democratic Club, which was renamed in Harvey's honor after his assassination in November of 1978. She also was a national delegate to the Democratic National Convention, both in 1980 and 1984, when she chaired the convention's Lesbian and Gay Caucus. In San Francisco, Gwenn also served on the Police Commission from 1987 to 1992, and twice served as chair of San Francisco's committees on redistricting in 1995 to 1990, and in 1995 to 1990, and in 2002. Gwenn also worked as a UCSF worked at UCSF for 25 years and retired from her position as a human resources manager in 2015. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And the first question, Gwenn, if you're hearing me correctly, sometimes as a reporter, when you write stories, you don't know what the impact could be. And recently, I contacted you because a photo of you, Bill, and Harvey has been reinstalled in the San Francisco airport, and you had thought that you might not be able to see it. And after the SFO Museum read that story, they reached out to you and invited you and your spouse to go visit the exhibit. I was hoping to ask you what that was like. And I should also mention, because this ties into our topic tonight, is that the photo of the three of you was taken by an AP photographer and probably ran in newspapers all over the country that year, because it was of the three of you the night that Prop 6 was defeated.
Okay, I didn't hear the last thing you said, but I know you want me to speak to that experience. And it was such a delight to get the call from Tim O'Brien, who's the exhibit manager there at San Francisco SFO Museums, and inviting me to come tour the exhibit, which is so expansive, and to see the photograph that you had sent me a copy of and I had seen before, but to see it at that size and scope was an experience. We had tried to get together just before the pandemic. There was going to be a big opening, but it got canceled because COVID came around and restrictions were put in place. So I thought first that happened, and now I was told that it was going to be moved to a totally restricted area. And to hear that I finally had the opportunity to see this exhibit I was gleeful. And it, even though I had seen it at its earlier opening before it had all of the photographs there, it still captured me with a wallet just to for the first experience seeing the events that happened at that time represented people who are now gone who
Sounds like we might have gotten disconnected a little bit from Gwenn, so hopefully we can get a better connection with her. Ken, in the exhibit that you helped curate down in San Jose that opened in June, you also went through a lot of old newspapers and coverage of the community. Did you happen to include some B.A.Rs in that exhibit, and what other papers were you able to highlight down there?
Yeah, we have a history of LGBTQ newspapers, and focused and printed in San Jose. And there's a whole showcase with all of the ones that we have in the years that they were printed. On the website, which is queersiliconvalley.org, we have an extensive section on those papers and who published them and whatnot. But I know that I always appreciated the B.A.R. And the first time I showed up was in '84 when we started the Baymac Municipal Elections Committee. I have to say, I was always on page 16 or 18, which was the greater area news. So, of course, you're barely 18 pages now, but that's where the stories ran. And I just also wanted to say that you always had stringers down here. One of them was Marv Shaw, that maybe some people know, and it was really his connection and my knowing him and knowing he knew Rich Gordon and other people in Mid-Peninsula, that I think that's the reason why we had as many stories in the B.A.R. as we did over the years. And I know that our papers down here almost never made it to San Francisco. So if I wanted to have any publicity or telling people what we were doing down here, it really was because of the B.A.R.
And I noticed when I was going through the archives, so you mentioned that story by Marv, but the first mention of you that I could find, and I had, was in our September 13th, 1984 issue about, it seems like you're forming a political pack through BAMEC, it sounds like. So it's very interesting on how I think people connect the B.A.R. solely to San Francisco, but the paper has for a long time covered the whole Bay Area.
I should say I have every article that I was in the B.A.R. And and now we have Heather Castle, who's the stringer, and she did a marvelous cover story on the exhibit in History San Jose. So you've always sort of had reporters available to write stories down here, and I certainly appreciate it.
And so, David, obviously you got a lot of credit for bringing up the idea of naming the milk terminal after Harvey. After you tried to get the whole airport named after him, it was a big media story both for us and the B.A.R., but for papers, I would think all over the country and world covered that issue. Can you talk a little bit about what it was like to field calls from the press? And it certainly was one story that also got a lot of TV attention as well.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you to the B.A.R. for 50 years. It's pretty incredible what you have done, and I can tell you that it's not just in San Francisco. I had the honor of working for Ken Yeager as a deputy county executive, and so much of the work that we were doing down there that focused on LGBTQ issues was covered by the B.A.R. And so I'm really grateful for that. I'll be honest with you, you learn a lot in politics. And I think that I was very naive when I first came up with the idea of naming SFO, the airport, after Harvey Milk. It was a very difficult political step, because what I didn't realize was that Harvey was truly someone who went against the grain, and he really, fought the establishment, including, by the way, the LGBTQ establishment. I didn't fully appreciate how many people that Harvey, went up against were still around and had still so much influence. And those individuals, by the way, had a lot of influence in the coverage. And key among them was, Dianne Feinstein, who I think, for whatever reason, took it upon herself to make sure that the airport was not going to be named after Harvey Milk. And she had a lot of power, still has a lot of power in City Hall. She, by the way, had a lot of power with the owner of the B.A.R. at the time, and so the coverage at times was not what you would think of a gay paper covering, the proposal of an airport named after a gay man. And so that was really interesting. I don't think that I fully appreciated that, but I think that made me more committed to the idea, because what I realized with Harvey Milk is that it wasn't just that he was gay, but that he was progressive, right? And that he was trying to bring up everyone, right? And, and we, by the way, persevered and really, organize and responds to the, backroom opposition. And that's how we ended up, with this compromise of a terminal being named after him. And, and I think in the end, the terminal itself shows what a great idea it was. And I don't say that just because I came up with it, but because of what it means. I had so many people who have shared with me the impact of going through that terminal. And, people from San Francisco, who I think are very proud of the role that San Francisco has played in the LGBTQ rights movement. People who are traveling into San Francisco, folks from California who are coming into San Francisco, and they'll text me and it's like, I'm in Terminal 1, Harvey Milk Terminal 1, and of course, for folks who haven't seen the exhibit, I would encourage you to see it. It's very moving. It's hard to do it without crying, I think, and then you see the incredible people that were part of that history. Gwenn Craig, of course, being, a key player in all of that. And then, what people don't understand, that it wasn't just the fight to get the terminal named after him, but even when we got the terminal named after him, we had to fight the airport to make sure that they did it the right way, because they basically wanted to just have it be Terminal 1 and then have a footnote that said, Harvey Milk. So we actually had to legislate the implementation of the name and work with Hillary Ronan, who followed me on the Board of Supervisors. And we had to order them through statute that it had to be Harvey Milk Terminal 1. And we had to dictate that the letters Harvey Milk had to be bigger than Terminal 1 because of how they were planning to do it. So it has been an ordeal. And I think eventually we prevailed. And I think the exhibit speaks for itself. And I think it's a testament to the rest of the world as they come to and from San Francisco of the very critical role that Harvey Milk played. And he's so inspirational. So I'm very proud of that.
And honey, you have an interesting experience in terms of coverage of you in the B.A.R. and other papers, is that it started off on focusing on your being an entertainer, and then later when you moved into politics. I was wondering, did you notice a difference of how reporters covered you from being an entertainer to then being in politics, or was it kind of the same?
Well, thank you, Matthew, for the question, and thanks for having me. I feel like I think it's different, maybe just from my end and the perception of things. I mean, I think there's a lot more pressure when you're answering questions about policy. It's much more easy, I think, to talk about yourself because the only person you can really hurt or damage there is yourself. But when you're talking about policies or your opinions about how things should be or could be, that has a much broader impact. So I do think it's maybe different on my end. I'm not sure. I guess, is it different for you asking me about performing or politics?
Not so much, but I have to say, after attending your kickoff event to become chair of the party and to become the first trans chair of our party, and I believe of a local party anywhere in the state, and one of a handful across the country who have chaired a local party, I filed my story. I went home, and on the TV I saw their story about it, and then they kind of kicked the story at the end, kind of explaining your drag name, and I just thought, like, that really wasn't a question I would think to ask or put in my article, and but they did. I don't know if maybe to personalize you more, or I just thought that was kind of interesting way to cover it, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think the media in general, we're not talking about the queer media here. We're talking about the mass media. I think for them, it is an interesting story that someone who at one time was a drag queen is now, in politics and running for office. I mean, I think we in the queer community know that drag and politics have always been closely related. I mean, having one of the first queer people to ever run, Jose Julio Saria, be a drag queen and be the founder of the Imperial Court, I mean, that is a part of our history. So, I'm honored to get to walk in, those footsteps. And I'm very proud of the coverage that the Bay Area Reporter has done me as a drag queen, and very happy with what's come out about politics. Of course, a lot of the times these days I have been asked mostly about what my boss is doing, so that's also different.
And that may change when, in a couple years. We'll see.
Okay.
Robert, I wanted to ask you about being somebody who's living and working in the peninsula here on this side of the bay and over in Oakland on the other side, where sometimes the media ignores both areas a lot. And certainly for you as an openly gay member of the Harbor Commission, I would always joke with you when I did the stories, you're a way down ticket on the ballot race that hardly anybody notices or covers. So what was it like for you to try to get the media interested in covering you as a politician, as opposed to, it's probably much easier to get stories placed about the Oakland port and airport?
Well, thank you for the question, Matthew. And first, let me just say that I really want to thank you for the invitation to this panel. And I'm really honored to be here with political icons from our community. So I'm just really honored to be here tonight. Yes, you're absolutely right that to get attention on the peninsula as a politician, you have to work 10 times harder. Because I think that especially San Mateo County, a lot of folks, with all due respect, a lot of people don't really know where it is. It's like there's a lot of education that has to be done. People know San Francisco, people know San Jose,
Yeah.
people know Oakland. I mean, people do know Oakland, but San Mateo County is this place that you kind of know, you heard about, maybe you have friends there, but there's a lot of education that has to be done. And it's really, there's a vibrant LGBTQ community in San Mateo County. And, lately there's been a lot of coverage on it. And I think there's going to be increasing coverage on it, but it's true. It's very true. We have to be a little louder to be heard in San Mateo County.
I think, Jim, you're going to show us a slide of some of the stories that include our panelists and other front pages of the B.A.R. over the years.
Yes, anyone is free to make comments if they have experienced these, or if they want to comment on it. I will start with the kind of it's chronological, and it doesn't cover everything, but let me see. Share screen. Allow, remember this decision, allow, entire screen. It's going to look weird for a minute.
While Jim's setting that up, I'll just do a little intro, as David had referenced it, and we've talked about Harvey Milk. So one of the founding publisher of the B.A.R., Bob Ross, became friends with Harvey and had hired him on to be one of our very first political columnists before he ever ran for office. And Bob, as David mentioned, was very close to Dianne Feinstein. And even though they had that relationship, she famously did not pick Bob to succeed Harvey on the board, and went with Harry Britt, who turned out to be probably way more progressive than maybe people were thinking. Gwenn, what can you talk a little bit about that experience after Harvey was killed and the mayor appointed Supervisor Britt?
Sure. Well, the first candidate that the community rallied around as Harvey's successor was Ann Cronenberg. And there was a big organizing drive to get community support all around. And Dianne was, a little not, non-committal about it. And it all came down to one comment, a joke that Ann had made at Harvey's memorial. And she started her comments at the memorial by saying, Harvey always said that I would show up at his memorial either wearing a dress or in full leathers. And everyone in the memorial audience, which of course was predominantly gay, laughed uproariously. Well, when Diane met with Anne in her office for the formal interview about whether or not she was going to appoint her, her first question to Anne was, "Anne, what are leathers? Would you wear leathers to City Hall?" And Anne said that she knew at that point, this woman ain't appointing me. So at that point, we had to do a reconfiguration and a quick new organizing drive. And Harry Britt was one of the people that that Harvey had always worked with closely, and he had mentioned him also in his famous tape. So we quickly reverted our efforts to get Harry appointed, and Diane was still a little wishy-washy. Well, I don't know who this guy is, and she finally, as a fallback, said, "Okay, I'll go with him."
I'd always heard that the leather issue also came up with Bob because he was part of the Imperial Court and part of the leather community as well.
Yes. Her big thing was she did not want her appointee to embarrass her. So she decided, well, this Harry Britt doesn't seem to do leathers or drag or anything that he's never been known to go nude in the parade. So maybe he'll be okay.
Jim, do we have that slideshow?
Yeah, I started it a little bit, but I'll just pick it up where we left off. Hold on.
Okay.
And
Great.
we're into the 70s. This is 1972, the second year of the paper. That is, of course, Sweet Lips on the cover. November issue. George Mendenhall, Reverend Ray. I don't know who this person was. This is another piece of trivia. Beard Demphill, a nom de plume. We don't, not sure who that actually wrote this column, but here is another moving into 1973.
Well, I know when I was looking up the first time all of our panelists were mentioned, I got a kick out of the fact, Robert, that we teased you with a photo before we ever even quoted you in the B.A.R. I don't know if you remember that issue.
I have it. It'll be later in the slideshow.
Oh no.
Well,
So
you wait for that.
it was a story about GAPA.
Okay, that makes sense.
Oops, sorry, losing my. There we go. Oh. Okay, so this is one of Harvey Milk's earlier columns. It didn't even remember to bold his byline because this was all hand typed and pasted onto a board. But that's one of his early columns talking about various political aspects. And here's a later one in 1975. I don't fly on the wall, I guess, is why they use that clip art. Not sure. These are all available on archive.org and downloadable as PDFs or JPEGs. You have to sharpen them up a little bit to read them. Another.
Oh, I was gonna say also, as it'll be coming up as we go through these. David, the first time I could find your name was actually in a political ad for Kimiko Burton for the public defender before I think we ever had interviewed you for a story, which back in the day, they used to run these ads with a whole wealth of LGBT people who had endorsed various candidates. And the other thing, as you look at the pages of the paper and the covers, I mean, the B.A.R. is always focused on politics. I know it has a reputation for when it started as being a quote unquote bar rag and just focused on, bar gossip or the leather community. But when you really look back at the early papers, politics in San Francisco, probably to none of our surprise living here, was a huge, huge topic of interest and something that was covered regularly from almost the first issue.
Yeah, and here's one of Wayne Friday's early columns when I'm not sure if he replaced Harvey's column in 77, but it looks like February, and then by July, Wayne was writing. I'm not sure when Harvey left the newspaper. I think it's in our political 50th anniversary article that you wrote.
Mm-hmm.
And here at the bottom, Gwen, you were mentioned at the bottom of the left-hand page. Matthew highlighted it. It's an article by Wayne Friday about gay coalition says no on A and B. And the Coors boycott on the right with the need is still going strong. And this is the December issue of the B.A.R. that covers in 5 different articles the assassination of Harvey Milk and Mayor Moscone, who should replace Milk, as Gwen was just discussing.
Yes.
And here's Wayne Friday's column about the assassinations. And even Mr. Marcus, our leather columnist, the first ever in the world, in the English typing world, wrote about, of course, about Harvey. And then we move on to some Gwenn Craig mentions in 1979. And I just grabbed, this is from the week after the White Night riots, obviously, in which in the ensuing pages, Gwen is also mentioned in the upper part of the birthday celebration. Do you remember that?
I do.
I zoomed in a little bit to show the silver jackets. I think were the John Sims. That is John Sims, the conductor.
Oh, yes.
Freedom Day marching band when he was still alive. Yeah.
Which is now the official band of San Francisco.
Oh, there we go. So here's a 1979 little politics cop. Feinstein, gay votes. The Sentinel staff go on strike. That's a lot of news. I like the makeovers of the banner as well. 1980, moving into labor disputes, Feinstein speaks to Tavern Guild, still with the same hairstyle.
Yeah.
And the jump page of that is Wayne Friday's column. The mid 80s, obviously a makeover. There were a lot of political bills and measures that failed and succeeded. And in 1984, AIDS got into it, as well as political, football for the bathhouses. Here, the Alice B. Toklas Democrats rejected the bathhouse ban, despite Randy Schultz's pleas. So that's interesting. John Molinari, say no to gay benefits plan. Again, lots of politics covering the front. And here's a mention of you, Ken Yeager, highlighted by Matthew. 1984 in September, South Bay activist, yay, Foreign Political Fund.
Yeah, and if I may say, just because you had the thing with the governor vetoes AB1, it was really that when that bill was on his desk, we had a local assembly member with the unfortunate name of Alistair McAllister, who wrote a op-ed in Mercury News saying that that gay people were so loathsome, they deserve no rights whatsoever, that the governor should veto the bill. And I wasn't completely out at that point, but I remember reading that, because people read newspapers in those days, in the Sunday paper. And I said, Ken, if you don't come out and work for your own rights, nobody else will. And so a week later, then I came out in the San Jose Mercury News.
Wow. Okay. And here you are mentioned for, yeah.
And therefore then forming the Bay Area Municipal Elections Committee. But it was just a great headline, where as we're trying to get legitimacy to be able to have the B.A.R. say it's a who's who of everybody in the South Bay. So that was nice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. In 1986, Duke Majin, is that how you pronounce it? I forget.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it's interesting to see the global coverage along with local coverage. Here's the Harvey Milk mural, Governor or Mayor Brown. And of course, the 1988 election with Dukakis, and there's Harry Brett getting some coverage. 10th anniversary of the Harvey and George Moscone March, Candlelight March.
Powerful.
Yeah, this is rare. I mean, it started to happen more often under different editors, that it was like a harkening back to the early issues where let's just do a full page photo on the cover because everyone will understand it and get it. And also getting a great photo that's worth doing that, like this one, probably Rick Gerhardt. The Castro political election celebrations are documented many issues. This is my favorite, though, because I was there dancing in the street. 1992. A little bit more. These photos by Jane Cleland. And this is the Pride issue for 1993. I just referenced this because in that section there you are, Ken.
Yeah.
In a much more legible.
Yeah, this is the running for the San Jose Evergreen Community College Board.
Nice. And here you are, David, in your first reference in the B.A.R., as Matthew mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
What is Kimiko Burton doing now?
Good question.
They come and go.
Yes.
This is typical of, I wanted to share this because it's typical of many of the organized full-page ads that really supported the paper. When election time comes around at any time, it leads to a larger newspaper, which leads to more editorials. So it makes me happy as a writer and an editor. But the combo ads that frequently show up, little clip and save guides. And here's Robert, here's a lovely color photo of you in this article from 2004.
Oh, yes. Okay, the marriage equality. Yes, that's right. My gosh, I'd forgotten about that photo.
I like your t-shirt too.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, yes, that's right. I still have that t-shirt, that boxer t-shirt.
Save it on eBay. Now, this is the Leather Week, but I thought I'd pop it in because of the Republican Gap Schwab connection. Some of you folks have raised the issues over the years about corporate duplicity of giving money to LGBTQ folks or organizations and then turning around and giving it to someone else. Robert is mentioned in this article as well. About Rose Tsai.
Mm-hmm.
Those were busy times.
And this is from our website. We're switching to formats. We're here for David's, your first appearance. At least, Matthew, this is his first appearance in an article?
That I could find, yeah. Okay. There's some issues with our archive. So there's certain years that don't show up for whatever reason. But so this was one of the earliest ones.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember differently, David? I don't know if is he.
We lost David.
Oh, he'll be back. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I remember that. God, so young.
And here we're going to our issue.com, much more colorful recent photos, 2011 variety of.
Yes.
There's David in the corner.
Mm-hmm.
Leadership changes. And here's, I think this was our first nightlight feature on you, honey.
Yes, though I do have some ones that predate this one that actually got saved. I have this one, which was from 2010 when I was in Dirty Little Show Tunes, and you can see I'm there in the corner.
Yeah.
And then, but I think the first time I was featured was in 2011 in the bar tab. I'll try and find it.
Okay, let me go through the scroll thing and we can share. This is another election night.
Found it.
Hold on, wait. Let's go to you.
I'm trying to see there. Oop. Live and in person. Here we go. Can we? Which way am I?
Hold on.
There it is. There I am.
I have to remove my screen.
It's hard to figure out.
Hold on, I'm not showing it yet. Hold on. So there. Whew. Okay. Oh yeah. Oh, I remember using that photo. I was doing the calendar then. That's right.
Yeah. So this one was from March of 2011, and then the other one was 2010.
Well, thank you for finding that. Let me get back to the slideshow. We'll finish cap this off. It'd just be another minute.
Yeah, I think the story and the slideshow was the first time that you were like properly profiled and interviewed for a story.
Yes,
that I could find.
This one.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the slideshow. We'll be done to just a few more. I kind of rushed through the last decade. But here you are in 2021. Did I? Yeah, there's only a few more. And this is this week's paper with ally David Chu being sworn in. So I actually could have finished that off. Okay, no more of that. I'm gonna back out, and you guys can continue talking. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
One of the questions I had emailed everyone about to think about was kind of, the first time that you picked up a B.A.R. or another gay newspaper or lesbian newspaper or magazine for the very first time. And honey, since you grew up here, what was that like for you? Because I'm from a suburban part of Connecticut, and there was, obviously no gay newspaper I could go to look to when I was in high school. So I'm wondering if you were able to do that here in San Francisco.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up on the West Side, so things were a little bit, they weren't quite as wild as you would think growing up in San Francisco. Pretty much a sleepier side of the city. But I do remember, sneaking over to the Castro and grabbing a B.A.R. and just, perusing through it. Although I will say that I think my most fond memories of reading the B.A.R. was when I was working at Larkin Street. I used to work just down the street from the Stud as a residential counselor over there. And I would go to the Stud, actually, walk to the Stud and grab a beer, and they always had the B.A.R.s in the front. So I would grab a B.A.R. and just sort of look through it and just look and see what was going on in the community. So.
And I should point out, for many, many, many years, our offices for the B.A.R. were right next behind the Stud, and we had a balcony between the upstairs offices, so we could walk between the offices and look down, and there was the Stud bar right there. And they were always very nice to us around Christmas time, and would invite us over some years to have a drink to just celebrate the end of the year. So it's one of my very favorite places to go when I first moved to San Francisco was the Stud, which, as I mentioned, you now are a co-owner. Any news to break about reopening in a location tonight for us?
We are still looking. We have definitely found some possibilities, and so we're trying to hopefully, fingers crossed, everything works out.
Okay. And Robert, I know when we first talked about you joining the panel tonight, you mentioned to me that you actually wrote, shamefully, quote unquote, jokingly, for one of the B.A.R.'s competitive gay newspapers in town. So when was your first introduction to the gay newspapers in San Francisco, and how did you end up writing for, it was the Sentinel, correct?
Yes, it was the Sentinel. So my introduction was probably when I was 16 years old, when I got my driver's license. I remember taking my grandmother to San Francisco, specifically the Castro. She was always intrigued by the queer community. She'd say things like, "Oh, take a look over there. Those gay guys are holding hands," and we'd be like staring at everybody. So what we would typically do is we would have lunch at Hot and Hunky on 18th Street, which no longer exists. And that's where I would grab a B.A.R. because it was always full of interesting news and a lot of photos of cute guys in the back section. So I would always do that at least once a week. I'd make sure that I had my copies. And then I ended up getting my very first part-time job at the Sentinel when it was around. And it's just interestingly, when I worked for the Sentinel as a freelance reporter, my boss was Michael Colbruno, who was the editor at the time. And interestingly, right now, he's still my boss because he is a Port of Oakland commissioner.
Yeah.
And of course, I work for the Port of Oakland. So, it's interesting how life just, it's just cyclical. It's so cyclical.
And what were some of the stories that you wrote for the Sentinel? And did you feel like you were competing with, people at the B.A.R. or other publications in town?
I didn't really think about competition at the time. I was just trying to think of really good stories. And I have to say probably the most interesting story that I wrote was I was assigned the 1992 Year of the Woman race with Feinstein and Boxer.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to interview both Senators Feinstein and Boxer and got to meet them. And also that was the same, there was a fundraiser where I also met the late Governor Ann Richards as well. So I would have to say that was a highlight of my journalism career, and those were fun times, I have to say. But I never thought of the competition between the two papers because I thought they were actually quite different.
How so?
Well, I found that the B.A.R. was more well-rounded in terms of just stories overall, and the Sentinel, I don't know, the Sentinel was more tabloidish, if you will.
And Ken, do you remember the first time you picked up either the B.A.R. or another LGBTQ publication?
Well, I certainly would have been aware of all the publications down in the South Bay. I really don't, I mean, other than occasionally going up to San Francisco, I just wasn't up there much. But you can imagine anybody and everybody would find a B.A.R. because that's how you knew what was going on. And so there was, the news part of it, but it was also the entertainment part of it as well. So, but the interesting thing for me with the gay press is because of the Bay Area Municipal Elections Committee, we sort of made news. And so I wasn't really sort of looking for news made by others, but making sure that my story was getting told. Because of these two defeats that we had in 1980, sort of connected to Anita Bryant and Save Our Children, when San Jose and Santa Clara County voters voted overwhelmingly not to allow non-discrimination ordinances to take effect, it just sort of killed the gay movement down here. And so politicians were just very nervous to even do anything with us. And so whatever I could do with elected officials that I knew, like have breakfast with them. I remember we had breakfast with Congressman Don Edwards one morning with the board. And that was on the front page of our paper, your paper, because it was just so rare that anybody would even meet with us. So it was sort of our way of sort of making elected officials feel more comfortable with what we were doing down here. And so it was more of a South Bay story. And again, most of my intention was here rather than in San Francisco. But again, always appreciated any coverage that we got down here.
Did you happen to pick up on any differences, like when a reporter for the B.A.R. or another gay publication was interviewing you back then compared to the types of questions that reporters at mainstream outlets were asking you, or did you sense there was any like skewing of the coverage in the mainstream press?
When the only thing I could really think about was in '96 when I was running for state assembly. There was an open seat, and it was probably the time that I spent most of my time in San Francisco getting very good coverage of trying to raise money. And there was a hit piece put out by one of my opponents. And in that sense, it was different, where the straight press continued to sort of cover the story. And this was not a story that I really wanted covered. And yet I couldn't persuade them to let it go. And so it just became a bigger story than just the one mailer that had went out. And that wasn't something that happened in the gay press.
And David, how about for yourself? And I'm also wondering if you were able to find Spanish gay papers in, when you were a youth that spoke to your experience as an immigrant and somebody from in the Spanish speaking community.
Thank you for the question, and I'm sorry that I had some technical difficulties, but I never really got exposed to an LGBT publication until the B.A.R. I mean, I guess in college, in the library, you would go and find some gay literature or something like that. But it really wasn't until I got to San Francisco that I saw that, and I think it was just really just eye-opening to see that there was a publication that actually was dedicated to covering the community, and obviously the news piece was important, but as folks noted, the entertainment piece was really great, and so that was pretty special. It wasn't until I got here that I saw that.
And then once you got elected, we do have Spanish speaking mainstream weekly papers here in the city, just like the B.A.R. covers the LGBTQ community. Did you ever have to, talk to the publishers about their coverage? Did you feel like their coverage was very, I don't know if it's pro-gay, but just was competent about gay issues and talking to you for various stories that they might want to do that covered LGBTQ topics?
I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know that they really did a good job of covering those topics, and I think that to this day, the coverage isn't really that LGBTQ focused. I don't think it's homophobic or transphobic, but I do think that it's not something that is covered, and I think that's the challenge, of being part of two communities. You end up trying to be a bridge between them, and I mean, I think the B.A.R. does a good job of covering what's happening in some of these diverse communities, as communities of color. So I appreciate that, but I'm not sure that the Spanish language media covers a lot of LGBTQ issues, and I think that's always a challenge, and for the gay Latino, experience, a lot, there is no more of a gay Latino scene in that sense, right? Esta Noche, is not around anymore, right? Mm-hmm. So that's something that's been missing for a while.
And Gwenn, if I could ask you, as someone who was around and started to see the start of and launch of some of these LGBTQ newspapers here in the city, what was that like? And did you notice that it started to have an impact on some of the political campaigns you were in, that you didn't just have to rely on, mainstream publications anymore to get coverage of some of these stories and issues you were working on?
Oh, definitely. We depended on the gay newspapers for reporting on some of the things that we were working on that were, gay-centered activities. I came here in 75, and I had the great fortune, just by certain happenstance, to move right into the Castro. The first place I lived was at 18th and Hartford, right across the street, directly across the street from what's now Moby Dick's. And I used to go every day to a place that existed at the time, the Bakery Cafe. Anyone who lived here at that time remembers it well, because it was very well frequented, and the newspaper racks for the Sentinel and the B.A.R. were right in the hallway as you went into the building and went downstairs to the cafe. So one of the things we'd always do before we went in and sat down to have our coffees was grab those newspapers first and sit down to have coffee reading those, along with the Chronicle to get tales of the city out of the way. So that was a daily ritual as well. But as far as covering politics, I definitely think that we looked to see what was happening in the B.A.R. a lot. And whether it was covering what were the organizing activities when Anita Bryant first started doing her thing. There were a lot of organizations that were popping up, and a lot of organizing activities that were happening during that time. And the way you learned about it was through the gay newspapers. And that's how I wound up at one of the meetings that I saw that was happening. And, I think the rest is history because of that. And, as far as what the clubs were doing, the Milk Club, the Tokeless Club, we also had a Stonewall Democratic Club back then. The coverage that we received kept the membership going. People were interested because of what they read in the papers of what we were doing. And so our membership thrived on that kind of coverage that we were getting.
Did you happen to have a change in your relationship with reporters when you went from being an activist and running the Milk Club to your time on the police commission or the redistricting panels? Did you have a different working relationship with certain reporters, in those dual roles you had?
Well, I think so on the police commission, that it was a different role, it seemed, than being the activist on the outside, appearing before a body, a governmental body, and testifying and calling for change rather than the one who was hearing testimony and responding to it. There were particular police events that happened during my short tenure, as it turned out, on the police commission. That were covered extensively in the gay papers as well as in the mass media, and how that was covered. I don't think that I received a free ride or anything, but I don't think it was also overly harsh or overly critical at the same time. I think it was fair and very. I think they did a necessary job of looking at how the police commission was responding to some of the events that happened and covering it fairly and covering me fairly.
And David, to ask you the same, when you went from being, a city commissioner to a city elected, did you notice a change in how the press either covered you or approached you on various stories and issues?
Well, I mean, I think that the mainstream press certainly doesn't prioritize certain issues, and the one thing that I would give the B.A.R. a lot of credit for is that it really emphasized the LGBTQ community and the issues impacting the community. And I think that was extremely helpful for me as an elected official, because it allowed me to push forward certain things, because I knew that the B.A.R. would cover the issues. And it wasn't because it was trying to give me, preferential treatment, but it was simply the fact that it was covering those issues, right? And so I think a number of areas, HIV funding, issues involving LGBTQ seniors, we were able to, prep, we were able to move the needle, rather quickly in San Francisco, because the B.A.R. was covering those issues, and that made it harder for our colleagues, my colleagues on the Board of Supervisors, and the mayor, for that matter, made it harder for them to not be for them. Going back to the milk terminal, I mean, you, Matthew, get a lot of credit because you were, so relentless in your coverage, and really helped make the airport accountable and moving that project forward. So I have been very appreciative of that, because I think that a lot of things would not have gotten done in City Hall without the B.A.R. paying attention to them.
Yeah, it's always hard to gauge as a reporter if you're just kind of writing into the wind, or if a story is going to have an impact. Sometimes it's obvious. Other times you don't know right away, and maybe it takes a year later and somebody mentions something and they're like, a story I wrote really struck with them, or what's fascinating to me, and I did a story about this for one of our anniversary issues, is to see stories I wrote oftentimes about all five of you and that other reporters have done on your colleagues in politics popping up in collegiate research papers, in National Park Service, context statements about the LGBTQ community. I mean, it's really fascinating that, as I said earlier, people can deride the B.A.R. and the other legacy gay newspapers across the country, but they continue to have an impact. And as our community's history gets more attention and people really want to learn about it, just like the mainstream press, we are the first kind of authors of the community's history. And hopefully we do as best as we can to get it as accurate as we can be, right?
Can I add something, Matthew? For us on the Board of Supervisors, the timing of when you published was really key, because introductions at the board happened Tuesdays, and we knew that if we could get something to you before Wednesday, that it would make the paper, so that was really important. And even to this day, I think for some of our straight friends, I don't think that they prioritize, the LGBTQ identity, and I think that you guys do, and I think that's really important. And if you're an LGBTQ candidate, I think that's very useful, very helpful, because a lot of straight candidates think that it doesn't matter anymore, and I think that you remind people that it does.
In that realm of being a candidate, having to run for office, the B.A.R., our editorial page was notorious under Bob for being very moderate and probably a little more conservative. But I don't know if people really understand that, I've worked for the paper now for 2 decades, and there really was never any pressure on us as a news staff to cover something in a certain manner. I mean, we were free to do whatever. So even if a certain candidate got an endorsement, it didn't mean we weren't going to give coverage to the other people running or not. But I've always been fascinated to know, as a politician, like, how do you handle kind of working with a paper, whether it's the B.A.R. or the Chronicle or the Mercury News's editorial page versus, us day-to-day journalists, reporters that are still having to cover you when maybe the paper didn't endorse you for a certain campaign. And Robert, I don't know, did you have that experience in maybe some of the San Mateo papers during your time on the Harbor Commission, and you could address that a little bit?
Yes. Thank you for that question. Oh my gosh, it brings back nightmares. So in San Mateo County, you absolutely have to get the endorsement of the Daily Journal, okay, or the Daily Post. So of course, I as a candidate, 2010, when I ran for public office for the first time, I did my rounds with the Daily Post and the Daily Journal. I got the endorsement of the Post, but I didn't get the endorsement of the Daily Journal, and I was like heartbroken. And I remember my campaign manager at the time says, "Don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. Keep moving forward with your other endorsements." And I remember, talking to you during those days as well, and I just felt this level of comfort, because I'm just like, okay, someone who understands gay candidates, it just. It was really tough. I was pretty heartbroken and devastated that I didn't get that endorsement. But in any case, we still won that race. And then during my reelection, the paper did endorse me then. So it was just like, oh my gosh, it's gut wrenching as a candidate when you don't get paper's endorsement, because that the broad reach that the press can have and the influence that the press can have. So yeah, it was quite nerve-wracking.
And Ken, how did you manage that down in the South Bay?
Yeah, and I'll try the answer to a little bit of what we were talking about before. I was always very fortunate to have the support of the editorial board of the Mercury News. I was on the ballot 9 times, and they endorsed me all 9 times. And I know that really helped, again, particularly for the San Jose City Council race, which was a major battle. And my being gay was something that my opponent was hammering, and her supporters would go around town knocking on people's doors that had a Ken Yeager for city council sign saying, "Did you know that Ken was gay?" And so with all of that crap going on, just having the Mercury support was very good. But on the other hand, on their news coverage, it was amazing how almost absent it was. I just don't think they, as David was talking a little bit about it, a straight reporter just wouldn't understand the nuances or the battles or the importance of things that were happening in the gay community. And it was just one of those things. There was a gay reporter for the Mercury, and who I knew, but they wouldn't allow him to cover any of the gay stories because God knows how biased it would be. From the days when women couldn't cover women's stories, or African Americans couldn't, whatever. It was that philosophy that they were going to be biased. And so the only times that I would really show up in the paper were the columnists, when they're trying to make a feel good story, or, hey, did you know that this happened today? And I was glad for that, when we raised the gay flag for the first time at City Hall in 2001, because nobody had ever thought about doing that before. Again, it was just a little sidebar, like on page 5. So anyway, it was just sort of interesting that it wasn't that the editorial staff or the owners of the Mercury News really couldn't make that connection to the greater community trying to provide better coverage.
And David, how have you had to straddle those two parts of the local papers in your races?
Well, I mean, I think it's something that you kind of eventually you understand, and as you know, for a while, the B.A.R. was owned by a very conservative individual, right? And so we knew, going into an endorsement interview that it just wasn't going to happen. When I first ran for assembly, they did not endorse me, the B.A.R., but I think I've always understood the difference between the editorial board and the owner, and the staff, and I appreciate, the fact that the staff has always been, fair and tried to be, objective irrespective of what the editorial board does, and I do think that's different. I think for those of us who are on the progressive side of San Francisco politics, unfortunately, we don't get that kind of treatment from the San Francisco Chronicle, and so, having the objective coverage from the B.A.R. is refreshing, and so we certainly appreciate that. As progressives, we appreciate that.
And then in terms of just kind of in general, just political coverage here in the Bay Area, have you noticed any, kind of standout changes? Is there less coverage now? I certainly have noticed that, the Examiner and the Chronicle both lost their political columnists, and it doesn't seem like there's as much political coverage anymore. Certainly not like when I first got here. And we also had the Bay Guardian as a printed paper.
Yes.
And now they do, are still probably around, and we have Mission Local as well. I'm wondering, have you noticed that as well? And what's your reaction? Do you feel like that's problematic, or with the advent of social media, it's not as big of a deal? Maybe Gwenn, do you want to kick off with that?
Well, I certainly miss the progressive papers that used to be around. I miss the Bay Guardian, the SF Weekly. I think that they left a void that gave more of a voice to a lot of the activists here and the progressive campaigns and candidates that were coming up. And just knowing what was happening in some of the movements that were happening in San Francisco. And we've lost a lot of the connection with that. it doesn't seem to be covered quite as much by papers like the Mission Local and others that I do see now and try and get a hold of or tap into what they're putting online. So I think that was a real loss. And I do like that we've got 48 Hills out there, but I miss having, a paper stand where the Bay Guardian was front and center and gave us something that gave real coverage. I hadn't really thought about the fact that we don't have political columnists now in the two leading newspapers of the city. And, that's a real deficit on the part of the newspapers, that I think they should think very carefully about, particularly in these times, in these turbulent political times, where it seems like the news is more political. The news is more about political trends and political happenings, and everybody wants to get into analysis of elections and what's going to happen in the next one and what's happening legislatively. To not be really feeding that appetite that people have for that is real oversight on their part, I think. Um, and San Francisco has always been a city that was highly tuned to politics in general and progressive politics in particular. And the press here seems to have really fallen short on that. And in some ways, I think it's intentional. There are certain forces that want to downplay the progressive side of our politics. There's certain people who've moved here into our city and thought, maybe that's a part of the city that, gives them a little grief about the tax breaks they get or things of that nature. And, maybe they don't want to see that side. Maybe they have an ear to the Chronicle or whomever and say, maybe we want to see a little less of that. But we need to, maybe speak up and push for more of it.
And honey, as both a legislative aide at City Hall and as chair of the local party, how have you been reacting to the changes of the media landscape when it comes to politics? And does that make it harder as party chair to try to get notice to some of the things that the committee here is working on and doing?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I agree with some of what Gwenn was saying, which is that I think that a lot of our news now is political, even things that, maybe in the past weren't seen as political. Everything seems to be politicized. And so I think we are seeing just in general this trend where everything is becoming more extreme. And even in San Francisco, a city where the vast majority of folks are Democrats, there is sort of like a more moderate and progressive extreme that I think, has been in conflict probably more so than in the past. And so that's been very, I think, hard to navigate. But I do think that there has been coverage. I think that people pay attention to what's happening with the Democratic Party in San Francisco. People pay attention to politics, and people are constantly reaching out. I know I'm definitely getting text messages from you, Matthew, when things are coming up. So I can't complain about a lack of coverage. I do think that, again, whether it be social media or whether it be actually written in newspapers or even just articles online, that people are definitely paying attention.
And so where are you getting your political news nowadays, honey? Whether it's LGBTQ focused or just kind of general, or where are you looking for that, and what are you reading or scrolling, maybe I should say?
Yeah,
that's a really good question. I was thinking about this earlier just today. Like, where do I get my news from, and what does that look like? I mean, I think when you are so involved and entrenched in it, and it's so many different things, it's sometimes hard to pause and think about what's going on. And sometimes people will bring it up to me and say, well, have you heard about this? And I have to say, well, no, I haven't even had time. I've had 6 meetings since the last 3 hours. And so sometimes I do find myself really needing to pause and say like, well, what's going on at the B.A.R? Or let me look through the website, or what's the Chronicle saying, or what's the Examiner or Mission Local saying? Because number one, I think it's important to have a breadth of input, right? And be able to understand what all the different sides are saying. But number two, I think it's really important that we don't just get our news from Facebook and Instagram, because I think, as we're seeing in these congressional hearings, the way in which these algorithms work, I think, have become incredibly divisive and have really, I think, hurt us as a nation and as a people, and in the way in which we were able to connect with each other and understand where each other are coming from. So I am trying to be more diligent about where I'm getting my news from. Again, not just from even YouTube, I think is problematic, right? Because we just see those videos that are recommended to us. And so I really go out of my way to make sure that I'm scrolling through different news websites.
And Ken, I feel like I'm in competition with you nowadays because as the Baymac Foundation, you've been doing a lot, I feel like, of creating your own mini news service down there for the South Bay. Can you talk a little bit about why you felt it was important for you to do that? And if people don't know how to get your emails, they can sign up via the foundation's website, correct?
Yeah, I almost want to say move over, Boomer. Yeah, just one quick thing. The Mercury News has always been center right, and as has been happening, of course, with newspapers across the country. A hedge fund came in several years ago, bought it, and then merged it. The East Bay Times, the Oakland Tribune, whatever, and so there's even less local coverage for these communities because they're fighting for leadership throughout the Bay Area. And so that's made it very hard. We have a group of former Mercury reporters that created an online newspaper called Spotlight, and very progressive stories dealing with the diversity of neighborhoods down here and what the impact. And they have Michael Vargas, who is a gay columnist that writes every couple of weeks on gay issues. So there's ways to sort of get information. And I have to say, the fact that I get, like everybody does, the daily email from the B.A.R. talking about, the news of the day is one way that you do it. And so you sort of patch it all together. And thank God for the New York Times, because, when you just don't think there's going to be another fabulous gay story, there it is. And again, just like the Baymac Community Foundation has its newsletter, you sort of, and Stonewall Democrats, and you sort of pick it up that way. But, just the fact that you've had coverage about LGBTQ anti-laws in Guyana and trying to get services for LGBTQ Afghan refugees. I mean, nobody's covering that stuff. And so, again, the B.A.R. still has a big role to play. But as far as getting time to that I send out, it's baymacfoundation.org or ken@baymacfoundation.org, and we'd be happy to put you on the mailing list.
And Robert, how has your experience been, kind of from your position with the port and in dealing with the Bay Area media and getting coverage of things happening? Port issues obviously have been huge news over the last year, as well as air travel. Can you talk a little bit about that? And we should also point out that and I forget the exact title for your port. Danny's title is what there, because your port's led by an openly gay man who used to be on the Oakland City Council as the first gay elected official there, who I actually happened to cover when I worked at a different straight newspaper over in the East Bay. So the cycle goes all over here in the Bay Area.
Yes, thank you, Matthew. Great question. Yeah, first of all, yes, Danny Wan is the executive director for the Port of Oakland. So he's the big boss here. And actually his senior management team, if I'm not mistaken, in the history of the port, has the most openly LGBT directors. I mean, there's myself, There's the environmental director, Richard Sinkoff, the aviation director, Brian Francis. So it's there's quite a rainbow coalition of LGBT folks here at the port. But to answer your question about media, I'm very fortunate to work for an agency that gets tons of coverage just because, you know, the exciting work that we do, but also because of the impact that we have in our three businesses. Obviously, the supply chain congestion issue is front and center in today's news, which who would have ever thought that supply chain would be what people are talking about these days? But they are, especially as the holidays approach and people are worried about their holiday gifts around the time. And also air travel is a very big topic right now for a lot of reasons. And, you know, our airport gets a lot of coverage on that as well. And of course, Jack London Square is in the news as well. So I'm very busy. The press office at the Port of Oakland is very busy.
And how do you keep up with local political news, whether it's mainstream coverage or LGBTQ news about politics?
Good question. Well, of course, the B.A.R. That's my go-to paper for my LGBTQ news. Every once in a while, though, you know, when I'm online, I will scan Washington Blade and the Gay City News online. I'll just see what's going on there. And then in terms of just general news, I like to get a perspective from outside of the United States. So instead of, you know, going to ABC News or CBS or CNN or something like that, I'll look at BBC News because I like to see what others think of us here in the United States. And so I'm always curious as to what the perspectives are. But that gives me more of a more global view.
So one question I'd like to bring up before we reach our 7:30 cutoff point is, what stories do you feel are not getting covered and really deserve coverage, whether it's in the B.A.R. or another local outlet? David, would you like to start off with that on a story you feel like a political kind of story that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves?
Well, I mean, I think that it's certainly what's happened with the pandemic and the disproportionate experience and suffering that some communities have experienced. I mean, everyone has suffered in the pandemic, but some have suffered a lot more, and I don't think that's really covered. But you know, I think I would add to the equation in San Francisco, going back to what people were saying, is, you know, the for progressives, there was a huge loss when the Bay Guardian went out of business. And even though 48 Hills has stepped in and done a great job of covering a lot of those issues, that is a huge loss. You know, the Chronicle is very conservative and very skewed in its coverage. And, you know, so it's not just the issues that are not being covered, but how issues are being covered. You know, their coverage of the issue of housing, you know, makes you think that, you know, everyone in San Francisco is a YIMBY, and that, that approach is where most San Franciscans are, when in reality, I think the issue is a lot more nuanced, but you wouldn't know it from, you know, reading that paper. And so I appreciate the balance that the B.A.R. brings on all these other issues, because I think that's really missing in San Francisco.
And Gwenn, how about yourself? What do you think is a story that deserves more coverage?
I think the disappearance of lesbian bars. I've seen a couple of stories in other newspapers in other parts of the country and in some national press. And it's quite amazing, actually, how few lesbian bars still exist in this country. And I think that people should be made more aware of what's happening and how that impacts so many women. And, particularly, I think there should be a focus on San Francisco. I saw an article that really focused on New York, and I thought
Mhm.
we should be talking about what's happened here and how many lesbian bars existed here, where they were, what they were, and the phenomena has hit here every bit as much as New York and other cities, and that's an article that I thought deserved coverage.
And honey, how would you answer that question?
I think I agree with Gwen. I think that, sort of the erasure of the lesbian scene here in San Francisco is kind of startling. I mean, I think that we have had a few resurgences, with Jolene's, and certainly I think El Rio is a queer space that it tends to, skew towards women, but we don't really have as much diversity as I think we would like to see in the San Francisco queer scene. And, I think Vice Chair of the California Democratic Party, David Campos, mentioned, the disappearance of Esta Noche from the queer nightlife scene. So, and when this is all a part of the sort of larger conversation of what is happening to queer spaces, and how are we dealing with that, and how are we preserving that, and how are we really, as a city and as a community, planning for what the future looks like. I mean, and that's really what got me into politics, is with the organizing around the Stud and the transgender cultural district, is this preservation of some of what makes San Francisco special, and the best of San Francisco. How do we continue to evolve and change as a city, but how do we, bring forward all the best parts of ourselves that we don't want to lose?
And Ken?
Yeah, I should also mention that the height of the bars down here in Santa Clara County, we had 14, and now we only have 2, and we haven't had a lesbian bar for quite a while. I would say the impact of COVID and the social isolation that it created in our community. I mean, there were so many companies and bars and places that were sort of marginal to begin with, but had to totally shut down. And so there was just so far less interaction and communication. And I just think it really had an impact on people's lives. For example, people who were in some sort of 12-step program, all of a sudden they couldn't be meeting anymore. And there were a lot of relapses that occurred because of it. And we know that the drug and alcohol rates increased over COVID. We had a community center, it had to shut down. And so all those support groups couldn't be meeting. You have seniors who even felt even more isolated, and certainly didn't have any contact with people and didn't know how to get to it because they may not have been computer savvy. So I think it just was a big toll that's going to take a long time for us to get over, particularly, young kids. We saw increase in suicides and in homelessness and in drug and alcohol use. And so I think that's a story that we all really need to sort of dig a little deeper and to see what it is that we can do to sort of repair all of that. And so should we go through it again, that we have programs and people who can help out.
And Robert, how about you?
Great question. I would really like to see more stories about LGBTQ candidates in suburban and rural areas. I think politics in general tends to focus on bigger cities. And we have to remember that there are LGBTQ folks in places like Clare, Michigan, and Grantville, Georgia. And I know because I've been to these places in my travels. And right now, example, there are openly queer candidates in city council candidates in places like Lincoln, Nebraska, and Ogden, Utah. And I think that would be fascinating.
I'm going to stick with you, Robert, for my last question of the night. And we'll circle back since we are celebrating the B.A.R. Reporter's 50th year of publishing. We obviously have a website like almost every newspaper needs to have these days in order to survive. But we still print and have a printed edition that hits the streets late Wednesday, early Thursday. And I'm wondering if you think it matters that the B.A.R. continue to be a printed newspaper as we look to the next, decades of the paper's existence. And why do you think it would matter to still have a printed copy of the B.A.R. rather than just having our website? Robert, what do you think about that?
Yeah, as I've gotten older, I've read the B.A.R. online much more than the paper version. And that's probably because I live on the peninsula and work in the East Bay, where there aren't newsstands near me that carry the paper version. However, having said that, I think it's important to have a blend of both for accessibility purposes. You know, we all get our news in different ways, and some people prefer holding the paper copy. And I think that, you know, to the extent that you can have it accessible to both, I think that would be great.
And honey, how would you answer that question?
I think that I'm somebody who's very tactile, and I like books. I've never read an online or digital book from front to finish. So I really love that. And also when we think about sort of the bigger picture about where people are going to get their information, also when we think about sustainability, I do think it makes sense to move towards digital, right? I mean, the environment should be our top issue across the country. And so if we're saving paper, if we're saving ink, and all of the industry that goes into that, then maybe that is for the best.
And David, how would you respond?
You're muted, David.
I'm sorry. This is the line of the last 2 years, right? You're on mute.
Yes.
But I mean, I get what's being said about the environment, but I do like the idea of having both, because I do think that there are many people who still don't have access to technology in the same way, and so I think for purposes of equity, that I think it makes sense to have the blend, and I certainly appreciate that the B.A.R. continues to do that.
And Ken, as someone who is located probably the furthest from our offices down there in San Jose, how would you respond?
Well, absolutely. I mean, to be able to do both, and certainly for readers up in San Francisco, and we're going to get back to the days that the B.A.R. is distributed more closely than it, in the future than it is now. But for someone who now has been doing this history project in Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, what a remarkable treasure the old newspapers are. For me to be able to go through almost all of the editions of all the newspapers gave me an unbelievable amount of information, and it's also something that you can put on a wall. You can put it in a frame. It's something that I think lives more than something that's digital. And so I think it's important to do both, because thank God for the B.A.R., who's recorded 50 years of history. You can imagine this would all have been lost if you guys weren't around, putting in all the time at very little money to be able to tell our story. And I think the printed edition allows us to do that.
And Gwenn, as somebody whose photo is in an exhibit with several front pages of the B.A.R. over there at the Harvey Milk Terminal 1 of San Francisco International Airport, how would you think it would feel if the B.A.R. were to not publish a printed paper?
Well, we would have lost a lot if it had not been on paper and continues to be on paper. I tend to read everything online now, I'm sorry to say, but I think it's important to have the paper version, definitely. I think it's important for the artwork that goes into creating the paper edition. And I think for the reasons that others have said, because of the reason of access is not equal. If there's one thing we learned from the pandemic, when a lot of people had to go online to get their education, not everyone was able to do so, or not able to do so equally. Not everyone has a computer or a device. Not everyone has broadband access, or the costs were prohibitive. So it's important, I think, to have equal access that I think a printed version gives.
Well, on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Bay Area Reporter, I want to sincerely thank all 5 of you for participating in this fabulous discussion tonight. I found it quite enlightening, and I appreciate you taking the time to not only talk to me tonight, but talk to me every time I called you on the phone and even when you didn't want to talk to me on the phone. So thank you.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, Matthew.
Happy birthday, B.A.R. Thank you, Matthew.